We'll go ahead and start.
Yes.
So we're going to start today with two tales of discoveries. Everybody knows about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there are a couple of other discoveries of ancient documents that people don't know as much about, and they both tie to our topic today, which is Gnosticism, spelled with a G, G-N-O, Gnosticism. And the first one, so we'll start with the pictures. I forgot to tell you. We're going to start.
I have them. Just 1 second.
All right.
I'm adjusting your camera.
Back at the turn of the 20th century, in the late 1890s into the early 1900s, a couple of British scholars discovered an ancient trash heap in Egypt. It was just where people had thrown stuff away in ancient times. I don't know, maybe in the 3rd, 4th centuries or something like that.
I have the image up.
You got it now? And of course, in Egypt, the climate was so dry that this stuff, whatever you threw in there, was still, it had survived. And to their amazement, this trash heap was full of pieces of ancient manuscripts, pieces of papyrus. A lot of them are just fragments, but there were hundreds of thousands of them. To this day, only a small percentage of them have ever been put back together and translated. Who knows what's still there that we haven't discovered yet. And a lot of them are at Oxford, but they're scattered all around the world. They let various scholars have the pieces of these. I think it's called the Oxfordist Discovery, papyri. And there were pieces of New Testaments and things like that. But among them was this sheet that I'm showing you a picture of now. And it was the strangest thing. It said it was sayings of Jesus. And a lot of them were sayings that we know from the Gospels, almost word for word, sometimes little changes. And people say, well, what is this? You know, it's obviously very, very ancient. The papyrus itself may come from like the 3rd century, but it's obviously, they were copying something that was much, much older. And it sounds like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, except Jesus doesn't do anything. He just talks. It's just the sayings of Jesus. So we've had this around since about 1900. Well, then in 1945 in Egypt, some peasants were digging fertilizer under a kind of a cave thing, under a cliff side. And they found a bunch of old codices. You know what? This is a codex, a book where the pages are glued here. That was not really in use until about the 4th century. Before that, you had scrolls. Well, these were codexes, and so they knew that they were, date the 3rd or 4th century. But the great thing about this story, this happened in 1945. And these peasants took these old books home and they just had them in their huts in their little village. And some Western adventurer found, what are these? And when he began to open them up, he thought, these are ancient books. And they just had a stack of. So the second picture are these codexes. They're called the Nag Hammadi codexes. And they're incredible, but they began to realize that all of them, or almost all of these documents, were Gnostic documents. I'll come back to that in a minute to talk about what a Gnostic document is. It was a Gnostic library that somebody had hidden under there, and then it had been covered with bat dung, basically, through the centuries. And these guys had found it. I don't know what they planned to do with these books. I think they were probably going to use them for kindling for their stove. Fortunately, they were rescued. And one of them was the whole book that this page I showed you a minute ago came from. And it started by essentially saying, I'm not quoting this exactly, but this is the gospel. These are the words of Jesus as told to Thomas, the apostle Thomas. the twin. And so we now call this the Gospel of Thomas. And it's all about Jesus. Well, it's not exactly all about Jesus. It's all about what Jesus said. There's no action in it at all. It's just Jesus talking, Jesus as teacher. And they began to realize, partly because of some slight differences, like a lot of the parables that are in the New Testament are in the Gospel of Thomas, but they make slight changes to it. And just for an example, instead of saying Jesus stood before the crowds and said such and such, in the Gospel of Thomas, it'll say something like, Jesus took his disciples into a secret room and told them such and such. It's that subtle little change that changes Jesus from a public teacher to the private teller of secrets. And this is the sure giveaway that this is a Gnostic document. This is a Gnostic Jesus, not the Jesus of our Gospels now. Now, Gnosticism was probably, it gets its development after the New Testament, the 2nd century and beyond. It becomes a real rival to Christianity. I mean, the early Christian fathers write long books against the Gnostics because they're really worried about that it's going to destroy Christianity. It has some similarities to Platonism, you know, the idea that we only see an image of the real world, and the real world is somewhere kind of up there. It has close connections with some Eastern religions, particularly with Buddhism, particularly the idea that the physical world is not the real world, that through something that happens to you internally, you are given, what is it that the Buddha got? He got enlightenment, right? He sat under the Bo tree and he received enlightenment, and he came to realize the truth. For example, that pain is not real, and that in fact the physical world is not real. What is real is what you get through being enlightened. It's something that's within you. Well, there's a lot of that in Gnosticism. I don't know how these ancient ways of thinking interacted. I think the ancient world, the people in the ancient world learned from each other a lot more than we realized they did. And that a lot of things we think of as being Eastern religions probably were learning from Plato, and a lot of things that we think of as being Western were probably learning from Buddha. And we haven't put all that together the real way that we should. But at any rate, here's kind of the way. Now I'm going to vastly oversimplify. It's a pretty complicated way of looking at the world. And I'm going to sort of glum several Gnostic systems together. But here's sort of the general idea. You probably won't find any one that's exactly like what I'm about to describe. But the idea is that there are a lot of intermediaries between the physical world that we live in and the transcendent deity, the transcendent God, who's way off there somewhere and totally different and not in communication with us at all. Okay. And the world that we live in, being so far from the transcendent deity, so far from the protection of God, is evil. It's as evil as you can get because it's as far away from God as you can get. So the physical world is evil. It's not just an illusion. It's actually evil. And so here we are as human beings. Now, human beings differ because some human beings long for what is right and good and true. And some don't care. They just kind of go to work, and then go home and watch TV. It's kind of what me worry sort of approach at life. Well, the Gnostics said, well, they just belong to this world. But some of us wonder, what is true? What is good? And their explanation was that some of us they have a myth about it, how the original transcendent God sort of exploded. And tiny, tiny bits of him have landed in some human hearts. And so we have deep within us this tiny germ, this tiny grain of the transcendent deity. And that's what's longing for God. That's why some of us long for God and others do not. We have that little bit in us. And it's longing to go home to where it originally came from the transcendent deity. But it's imprisoned in our humanity, in our bodies. And that sounds a lot like some forms of Greek philosophy too. And so what we would like to do is be freed from this material physical body and from this world that we are in. And how do we get that? And here's how we get it. We get it by receiving the gnosis, the knowledge. That's just a Greek word for knowledge, gnosis. And it's, again, a lot like Buddha getting the enlightenment. If you can get the gnosis, then you will understand. And salvation for a Gnostic is understanding. There's the big difference in Christianity. They both talk about Jesus, but the big difference in Christianity and Gnosticism was that the Christians said, Jesus has come to redeem us from our sins and to rescue us from a sinful world. And the Gnostics said, no. Jesus came to give us the secret knowledge which frees us from the evil of the world around us. See, we're not the ones who are evil. We're ignorant until we get the knowledge or get the gnosis. So redemption of our spiritual element that's imprisoned in our bodies is what we're seeking for. And gnosis is the way to gain freedom and release. And then, so how do you live your life? Well, the Gnostics said there's one of two ways you can go. You can either be ascetic, that is, you can separate yourself from this world as much as possible. So you deny all human pleasure, all physical pleasure, and you live ascetically. Or you can go the other way and just say, since my body is totally evil and the world around me is totally evil, just do whatever feels good. And so that was antinomian Gnosticism, where anything goes because it doesn't matter. Your inner spark is going to be pure no matter what your body does. So you had both kinds of Gnostics, the ascetic Gnostic and the antinomian Gnostic. Now, Gnosticism borrowed a lot from Christianity. For one thing, it borrowed Jesus. It took the teachings of Jesus, not the crucifixion of Jesus or the resurrection or something. It took the teachings of Jesus and it gave them all that kind of Gnostic twist. He's telling us the secrets of the eternal transcendent God. And so that's the Jesus that you find in the Gnostic Gospels. And several of these books that were found at Nag Hammadi, these codices, are Gnostic Gospels. There were several of them. They've all been translated in English. James Robinson, who taught at Claremont, I knew James Robinson well. He's the guy who supervised the translation of all of these documents. And so we know a lot more now about how the Gnostics thought and so on. Now, I'm going to quit shortly here, but I just want to refer to a few, what you need to watch as a sort of sophisticated New Testament reader. Watch for signs that the New Testament writers are saying, don't bite when the Gnostics are trying to bait you. Don't accept it. And this is very subtly done in the New Testament because the Gnostics had not gotten organized. Eventually, there was a kind of Gnostic church, and there were Gnostic apostles, and there were Gnostic scholars, and there's Valentinian Gnosticism, and there's different kinds of Gnosticism. but it's just, the ideas are just now beginning to interact with these early Christian groups, and people like Paul, and particularly the Johannine literature, particularly the Gospel of John and the letters of John, show that the author is already worried about the influence of Gnosticism. Because it's a very different thing to say that Jesus came to tell certain people secrets and to say that Jesus came to save the world. That's a very different Jesus. And the early church writers of the second and the third century are very worried that as we get they got further and further from the lifetime of Jesus, that the real Jesus was going to disappear into some kind of Gnostic speculation. And we owe them a lot for what they did and say Gnosticism is not right. And they wrote hundreds of pages to try to show how it was not. So let's just look quickly at some passages and so where you can see the Gnosticism peeking through. First Timothy, by the way, interestingly, has a lot of this kind of thing. First Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20 says, avoid the irrelevant babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. Actually uses the word Gnostic, what is falsely called Gnostic. So here the writer is telling these early Christians, be careful, these people sound good, but it's babble and it's contradictory, and avoid it.
Excuse me, John, would you repeat which?
Yeah, it's First Timothy 6 and verse 20.
20, thank you.
Yeah. I should tell you, by the way, when I went away to graduate school, my father, who had a little machine where he could make rubber stamps, whenever I'd get a letter from my family, stamped on the back of the letter, it said, avoid the irrelevant babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge.
Come on.
Yeah, I used to get that almost every letter I got from home.
Did they do that for you? Were they worried about you being in school?
Well, they just said, we don't know what they're going to tell you there, but just be careful. Yeah, that's what. They didn't need to tell me. I was always careful about what any professor told me. So, but anyway, I think that's interesting. 1 Timothy 3, verse 16. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the Gnostic Jesus is not a real human being because human beings are bad. Okay, so Jesus only appears to have a fleshly body. He doesn't really. By the way, he didn't really die on a cross either. Nothing that would identify the real Jesus as a totally spiritual being that came from the transcendent God. They took all that as being parable, symbolic, so on. So what does 1 Timothy 3 verse 16 say? He was manifested in the flesh. What's that word flesh in the New Testament? Because they're contrasting what they understood and believed to be the real Jesus with what's coming to be known as the Gnostic Jesus, the Jesus who's an apparition. There was even an early sect, they were called the Docetists, D-O-C-E-T, the Docetists, and that word in Greek means to seem. A Docetist was somebody who said Jesus seemed to be in the flesh, but he really wasn't. Well, the New Testament writers are very careful to say to the early Christians, don't go for that. 1 Timothy chapter 4, the beginning of that chapter. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times, some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and prayer. You see, The Christians were world accepting. Now, not the human structure of the world. That's the world the humans said, no, we have nothing to do with that. That's evil. But the world is good. God created the world and it is good. That's absolute opposite of what the Gnostics were saying. And the whole Gospel of John, you can read. In fact, this Gospel of Thomas, some scholars say that it may be as old as the New Testament. It was already possibly around and circulating at the same time that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were. So the apostles may have known this gospel. And there's a lot of things in the Gospel of John that if you've ever read the Gospel of Thomas or you know something about Gnosticism, you can think, I think John is, is talking about the Gnostics here. When he says, look, we saw these things, and we touched it. We used our senses. Notice how many times in John he says things like that. And John is typically understood by scholars to be one of the last books in the New Testament written. So it would be that by the time when this idea is beginning to come in, beginning to come up. So it all sort of fits with that kind of assertion. Let me just mention one other passage from 2 John, where it's pretty obvious what John is talking about. I didn't write down the verse number, but 2 John is not very long, so you can find it. He says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is a deceiver and the Antichrist. By the way, the next time you see somebody on TV telling you who the Antichrist is and it's Putin or somebody, it used to be Stalin or Hitler, and now, who's the guy we don't like in any given period of history. I always, whenever anybody ever tells me they know who the Antichrist is, I say, I know who the Antichrist is too, because it tells you in the Bible specifically who the Antichrist is. The Antichrist is someone who is telling you that Jesus did not come in the flesh. So they're literally Antichrist. It's not just a nasty name to call somebody. It's just a description of that, what that person believes. So, but you see, putting that in a Gnostic context, what that's saying. These ideas that Jesus is some kind of a phantom who sort of slides in from another world, calls you over and whispers a secret in your ear that makes you different from everybody else. The New Testament writers are harsh in their criticism of that. These people are deceivers. These people are liars. They use really harsh language about them because it simply eats the heart out of the gospel. Basically what it does. So that's Gnosticism. And it's kind of fun sometimes when you're reading through a New Testament passage, particularly somewhere in John, or that's not the only place, somewhere in the pastoral epistles, somewhere. Look between the lines for the Gnostics. They're liable to be there. So,
Hey, John, I have a question.
yeah.
And this may be a very ignorant question. I'm thinking of traces of Gnosticism through history and movements now that we have roots of that. So would something like and I don't know much about this group, but like Church of Christ scientists, would that be considered like modern Gnostic, or is that totally the antithesis of Gnostic?
Well, there are some, actually in the period when Christian Science became very, very popular in the United States, there was quite a lot of emphasis on the reality of the spiritual and the overcoming of the physical by the spiritual. So it's not quite the same thing. I don't think you have a denial of the flesh. You certainly don't have a denial of the fleshly Jesus and so on. You do have that sort of the power of the mind over. You have it in
That's
a lot of
that's what I was thinking.
you have it in a lot of secular systems too. If you're the power of positive thinking, it's not too far from the power of positive thinking to Gnosticism. Now they were a lot more mystical and sound a lot more religious. you know, but that idea that that mind somehow has a certain power over the physical world. Christianity is just never been world denying like that. When you get, I gotta give this back to Fallon, but that whole thing, it's not accidental that monasticism first grew up in Egypt, where Gnosticism was so powerful, because monasticism was based on the idea of reject. You know, you never sleep on a bed that's comfortable. You sleep on rocks. You never eat anything that tastes good, and somehow this makes you a holier person. Celibacy, the whole idea behind celibacy was that somehow you were purer if you were celibate. There's nothing like that in the Old Testament. There's nothing like that in the New Testament. Christianity was accepted the world that God had created, and then put it under a moral structure. Whereas these kinds of systems always say, no, the mind is where the truth is, and you sort of whip the world into subjection by the powerful use of your mind. And there have been lots of formulations of it through the years. By the way, before I quit, next week's our last week, and Fallon's not going to be able to be here. And what I'm proposing to do is have questions and answers, and then we'll sort of go back through and talk and have a couple of sentences about each class that we did through the whole thing. And maybe that may trigger some questions too. So, and then we'll be finished.
Awesome.
We've discussed everything there is to discuss.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, John.
You all could have honorary doctorates like we got those. These are this is what we're gonna be reading. We're gonna look at John 1 and we're gonna look at 1 John 1. But before we do that, we're gonna talk a little bit about proto-Gnosticism, which predates Gnosticism. But before we do that, I want to just mention and acknowledge neo-Gnosticism, new Gnosticism. And even more so than Gnosticism of the ancient world, neo-Gnosticism takes a huge diversity of forms. And the early Christian writers were really right to be super threatened by Gnosticism in the early centuries. It never really went away at all. And in fact, as John was talking, maybe you were thinking about some contemporary theologies that have seeped into Christianity that don't always, that sound a little bit more Gnostic than they sound biblical. As a professor, I deal with this particularly in my early religion classes. I teach Religion 100, which is one of the required courses, Way of Jesus for students. I also teach Religion 300, which is the third required course after they take Intro to Jesus, and that's not what it's called, but it's essentially Intro to Jesus and then Intro to the Bible. I teach Religion 300 as well, and what I have to help students a lot through deconstructing neo-Gnosticism that has seeped into their Christian theologies. A really prominent one, for example, is that the whole gospel, the whole entirety of the good news revolves around escaping this world after we die to go to a disembodied heaven. Very neo-Gnostic. Like very neo-Gnostic, deep roots in Gnosticism, that the earth is something evil that we escape, God rescues us from it, and we go to like our souls don't have bodies anymore, and we escape to a disembodied heaven after we die, and that being the entirety of the gospel. It is really hard to challenge neo-Gnosticism. It is deep rooted in our understandings of how the world works, of the meaning of what it means to be Christian. So it's not just that like today's neo-Gnosticism is a competitor with Christianity or is like another philosophy where someone will be like, oh, hi, I'm a Gnostic. It's that it is highly syncretized with Christianity. And I can go through an entire semester and be like, look at all of the ways, like every time in the synoptic gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, every single time the word gospel is used, it's talking about the kingdom of God coming near to us here on earth. You know, look at this prayer of Jesus. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Like the union, Revelation is all about the union of the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth. And at the end of the semester, I'll say, what's the good news? And they'll say, we got to go to heaven after we die. And I'm like, oh my God. And it's like the neo-Gnosticism is so rooted. And I'm not saying that that spending eternity with Jesus and with God is not good news. That is absolutely good news. We get to spend eternity with God, and that is beautiful and good, but not to the exclusion of the good and beautiful creation that God created and is actively redeeming alongside and with us, right? So it's highly Gnostic to say like, well, my soul gets to escape this evil around me to be disembodied with God. There's a really great a thought that has shaped me profoundly that is anti-neo-Gnostic, that it is actually a rejection of our creatureliness to want to be disembodied like God. That God created us originally with bodies and called those bodies, called the material world, called creation very, very good. And to hope for, to long for, to expect an escape from the embodied world into a disembodied heaven is actually a sort of rejection of our creatureliness, and in some ways a way of imposing ourselves into the realm of God in a way that rejects the parameters God gave us, the good parameters God gave us. So I always emphasize with my students, eternity with, I believe that we will spend eternity, we will be resurrected, we will spend eternity with God. I just believe that it is a bodily resurrection, and that God affirms the creatureliness, the goodness of creation, the creatureliness of humanity, through creation and through incarnation, through Jesus being incarnated. So as we look at the Johannine texts that I have listed here, this is John 1 and John 1 and 1 John 1. The first few verses, I want to look at that, but I'll pause before I do any responses to that. Don't accuse me of heresy. My students sometimes mishear me because, again, that neo-Gnosticism is so like deeply rooted. It can be really hard to hear something else and be like, wait, but that's not what I've always learned, which I totally get. And like I'm more interested in the imagined world that the Bible projects for us, and that helps us along.
One
Yeah,
Pauline
please.
statement that sort of fits with that people might overlook. Paul one time, he says when he's talking about resurrection, he says it's not that I long to be unclothed, but to be clothed over.
Yeah, that's good.
It was a real insight one time when someone pointed out to me, what if all the times that they talk about the resurrection in the New Testament, what if that's not metaphor? What if
Yeah.
they're actually literally meaning, and then when you the New Testament with that idea
Totally.
that actually is a new body, just as there was kind of a
Yeah.
physicality that Jesus had after his
Yeah,
resurrection, that it actually makes some things make sense in a way that
Totally.
didn't make sense
of all the things we should be taking literally in the Bible, the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of us should be at the top of the list.
Right,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, not that it's not still around, but it was super popular, the NOTW, not of this world stickers. And,
Yeah.
And that always, like, it's exciting to think we're different, but then that becomes very exclusionary. And how do you get in, and what about everybody else? And were you not, Jesus talks about how I came for the lost, I came for the sick. And so it's just that very idea that we're not of this world and we're moving on almost indicates an ability not to care for people who haven't made that decision with us. And that's very rooted in knowledge. Like, we now know Jesus.
We know better.
And we use the word faith, but I think we're using faith as we know and other people don't, and they're either dumb or they are rejecting, and so they don't deserve that chance.
Yeah.
And so that's just troubling.
That's
Yeah.
an attitude I definitely reflected among my students.
Yeah.
Who come from a variety of backgrounds.
Yeah, and there's a difference between recognizing that the world around us is caught up, there is darkness, there's brokenness, there's evil around us, of course, and within us. And to affirm that the reconciliation, that all of creation, all of the world is caught up in the reconciliation and the redemption of Jesus. The earliest Christian hymns that we have recorded in Colossians, and a couple other places in scripture all talk about that all things are caught up in the reconciliation of Jesus. That is very different than saying like, hey, there's a part of me that doesn't belong in this world. Sound familiar? Like a little spark in me, maybe, that doesn't belong in this world, that gets to float up and reject this world, that is not of this world. That's Gnostic. So anyway, to be really hyper aware of neo-Gnosticism in our own theologies, in our own perceptions of the world, and can be really helpful. I hear neo-Gnosticism bleed through, even in very prevalent, very prominent, very popular Christian theology and biblical interpretation. So, okay, let's look at John. So there are a lot of ways to read John 1, 1 John 1. John 1 is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. It is just a stunning, a summary is not the right words, a stunning description of who Jesus is. And I love it. And there are so many ways to read it and interpret it. Today, we're just going to kind of read it, interpret it, and say like, okay, let's assume that John was writing in somewhat response to proto-Gnosticism. So Gnosticism or proto-Gnosticism being kind of the seeds of philosophy that kind of developed into Gnosticism and the various forms of Gnosticism later. If Gnosticism and proto-Gnosticism were prevalent already during the time that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written, then that means that by the time John was writing at the end of the 1st century, these already would have been philosophies that were being introduced even into Christian theology and were prevalent in the broader world as well, that John would have been in dialogue with, that he would have been familiar with, and in some ways responding to even in the process of writing his gospel. Now, that is not to say we're going to read them now and look at the like Gnostic kind of the conversation with Gnosticism that John is in. That is not the only way to read John 1. I don't even necessarily think it's the most important way to read John 1. And I think we can read it and hear some of the ways that John is in conversation with Gnosticism. There was one other note I wanted to mention before I started. Well, maybe it'll come to me as we start reading. All right, so we're just going to read a couple lines at a time and unpack some of the ways that we see Gnosticism, John in conversation with Gnosticism as John writes. Oh, this was the thing I wanted to mention. Similar to Paul, we have experiences of this in the Pauline epistles in particular, and even examples of it in Acts. The New Testament writers didn't rarely actually ever take a doctrine or a philosophy and unpack it line by line, challenging it and saying like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. We have other types of early writing that do this, but more often what happens in the New Testament is stepping into the worldview of someone else and reframing that worldview in light of Jesus's life, Jesus's death, Jesus's resurrection. So a good example that might be more familiar to us is Paul's sermon on the unknown God. Paul steps into the worldview, the pagan worldview, not to affirm paganism, but to say, look at you even have an unknown God, and then reframes that worldview in light of Jesus. Does that make sense? Are you catching me? Or Ephesians, we talked about this. Paul stepping into the worldview, the Aristotelian philosophy that's in Ephesians 5, for example, and then saying, and then challenging it, right? Analyzing it or reframing it in light of Jesus and the way Jesus calls us to live in relationship with each other. So we have lots of examples of this, and I would say that John is in conversation with Platonism and with Gnosticism, at least in part. That, again, not necessarily the central thing, but let's look at it for a moment in light of that. Oh my God, it's already 9:51. Okay. All right, so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, the same exact introduction as Genesis 1. John is reminding us of the goodness of creation and Jesus's presence with God at the beginning. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. So if God created all things and God is good, and God is revealed in Jesus, then creation, the world is good as well. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. So I don't know what the Greek is here, and so maybe John can correct me. But darkness is a really good metaphor, both for evil and for lack of knowledge. right? Ignorance. So John again is stepping metaphorically into a worldview, but challenging it, and later makes the connection between darkness and sin and things like that, and emphasizes the part of darkness that is about sin and evil that is part of all of us, as opposed to focusing on ignorance as a part of it. But darkness is a good metaphor for both ignorance and for brokenness. Then we get introduced to John the Baptizer. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. Again, that word enlightenment as both a way of exposing darkness as evil, but also enlightenment as revealing knowledge, right? So again, you hear this philosophy kind of bleeding through, but John is stepping into it in order to challenge it. But of course, there's also lots of other meanings of this, right? Like God has always been described as light, and things like that throughout the Hebrew Bible and stuff. Yeah, go ahead, Diana. Did you have something?
Yeah, may I? If we go back up to the first
Mhm.
section in 1 John 1:3, when it says all things came into being through him. And
Yeah.
without him, not one thing came into being. Based on what John was telling us earlier about the Gnostic belief that like God kind of exploded and there was a little piece of God in everybody. If God exploded, then there would not be a him, because it's saying without him, nothing could come into being. And so
Right.
this, I think, is addressing that also. It's okay, I got a nod.
And there's the all things too, right? It's
Right.
not these special few humans who have a spark of the divine in them that they get rescued. It is that all things are in existence because of an active choice of an active God, not an exploded distant God.
Thank you.
For sure. Anything you want to add before I continue, John?
Well, no problem, just this, that I didn't talk about this, but the Gnostics even had to create, they said that the God that you read about in the Old Testament is not the real God. They call him the demiurge, because the real God wouldn't have made this world. So they just kind of flipped the Old Testament completely around. So the story of creation is a terrible story to them, because it's this sort of dumb God who messes things up and creates this messy world that we have to live in. So yeah, it's,
You have to jump through a lot of hoops to get there.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll also point out too, since Platonism or Plato's philosophy might be more familiar to you, you can see the seeds of proto-Gnosticism being rooted in Plato, through this kind of light, the light metaphors as well. Again, not exclusively Platonist. The light metaphor is more than just a response to Platonism or Gnosticism. But in Plato's philosophy, in his kind of core metaphor, the cave and the light enlightens, and we realize that the things that we see around us are actually just forms, and then you emerge out of the cave and you are enlightened, and you realize that those things were just shadows, and the real things are so much more than that. And so light being a really key part of Platonist metaphor as well, or Platonist philosophy as well. But again, I want to emphasize, John 1 isn't exclusively a response to Plato or Gnosticism. In fact, I don't even think it's the central way to read it. But it is really interesting, right? To think about some of these philosophies that were floating around and how John is responding to them while also making true and beautiful claims about Jesus and Jesus's character. Like it's an incredible writing, and just remarkable theology. He was in the world, this is picking up in verse 10. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. So again, an affirmation of Jesus's incarnation. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will or of the flesh or of the will of humans, but of God. I see here too in the bolded part there, a conversation with a challenge to this idea that only some people are pre-selected, but instead it is this trust in the name of Jesus as opposed to a specific knowledge with which we are enlightened that allows us to transcend. Does that make sense? Are you hearing the difference there, sort of? Yeah. No, Diana says no. That's okay.
I think I just got lost. Go
No,
on.
that's all right. That's all right. And the word became flesh and lived among us. I put in brackets there, tabernacled. I don't know of any translation that actually puts it there. I'm sure there are, but this is the NRSV, and doesn't put tabernacled. But I put it there because that Greek word means to live in a tent. So it is a connection to the tabernacle in Exodus. So while that first section, verses 1 through 4 are in response to, in dialogue with Genesis and Genesis creation, in verses 14 through 18, John is in conversation with Exodus, with God being present among us in the world, tabernacling being the primary metaphor in the primary way that God did that in Exodus. And so John is making a connection there as well. And the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me." From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. That last verse here, who has made him known, the him is actually added. The sentence actually isn't completed. Who has made known, end of thought, is actually what the Greek says, who has made known. And so John leaves it, it's like Jesus makes known everything through Jesus's existence. But obviously this is a different kind of knowledge than simply enlightenment, right? It is a revealing of the true nature of God and of all reality. I just find that really interesting. We add the him in most translations so that it like makes sense in colloquial like English. But who has made known is what it actually says at the end of that verse there. We also see from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Again, this kind of emphasis, re-emphasis, refocus on sin, not on exclusively just a lack of knowledge or ignorance. So it's truth and grace that Jesus brings to us, not just truth or knowledge. All right, it's 10 o'clock, but we have time for a couple questions or comments, observations, corrections. We're not going to look at 1 John, though I hope that you skim through these bolded notes. The second part of 1 John really emphasizes sin. So again, challenges this idea that the only issue is lack of knowledge. The true issue is that darkness, brokenness, evil has permeated all things, including humanity. And we are all in need of redemption, of a reconciliation, of healing, of saving. It's not just enlightenment or knowledge that we need. So 1 John really focuses on that in those first few chapters or first few verses. And then in 1 John, in the first verse, you can see an emphasis on the real materiality, the real incarnation of Jesus being affirmed by John, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands. So there's also a repetition of the light metaphor in that one. So yeah.
Just one thing is, it's interesting in the modern world, the prevailing idea is that Jesus was just a man. In the ancient world, the prevailing idea that the early Christians had to deal with was, no, he was just a God.
Mhm.
So you can see how John's trying to deal with it. No, he was not just a God. He was there in the beginning and created and so on, but he became flesh. So we sort of have, I think, in modern secular culture, we have a different problem. It's denying the divinity of Jesus. where in the ancient world, there was a tendency to deny his humanity. And all of these various divisions that Christianity went through in the first several centuries all had to do with how much was Jesus God and how much was he man. It just took
Yeah.
centuries for people to grapple with that, try to work it out.
Mhm.
So, yeah, he became flesh,
Mm.
dwelt among us.
All right, see you down at the chapel.